I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Reading Museum, and we're interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC opening its first office in the United Kingdom. It's May the 8th, 2024, and we are online. And I'm here today talking to Ken Sr. Ken, let's start with the basics, please. Please tell me your full name and your place and your year of birth.
My name is Kenneth Williams Sr., and I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, USA, in August 1939. And my mother was born in Boston, but she's very proud of her Scottish heritage. And my father was born in Newfoundland, and his forebears had come from England. And I grew up mainly in Waltham, Massachusetts, just outside Boston, which is where I'm speaking to you today.
And what did your parents do? Any kind of, sort of work or careers? Or and other brothers and sisters as well?
My father did a whole variety of jobs. Of course, they both grew up through the Depression, and as I say, I was born in '39. My father worked in factories all his life. He was, and when I was in my mid-teens and so on, he was a supervisor in a factory also here in Waltham. And my mother did various kinds of work. And there was sort of middle-class American people. They own their house and so on. And um, I had four siblings, three brothers and a sister. And I was number four of five. And so had a good upbringing.
And what was school like? What did you? Obviously, the American system is slightly different to the British system, and even let's say even by the British system back in the day in the UK. What was the school you went to, and what did you study?
Yeah, I went to the primary and secondary schools right nearby, sort of within 2 square miles of where I lived, and um, graduated high school when I was 17. That was the 12th year. It would be equivalent to, I think, the 13th year, as I understand it now, with sixth form. And my schooling was, I would say, fairly unremarkable. I never had the idea that I was headed for college, and so I didn't train for college. And although I enjoyed math and science courses, I didn't have the full gamut of those courses when I was a kid. And next, you'd like me to get into what I do after school?
So tell me. So you said you would. Did you say you struggled at school? You weren't particularly interested in school subjects.
Yeah, I was not a great student. There were some things I was interested in, but I would say a good part of the time I was largely often bored. I would talk to the guidance counselors at times, and they would say, Kenny, you're so bright. Why don't you get better grades? And I would say, well, I just wasn't particularly motivated around getting good grades. In fact, motivation is a big part of how I would describe events in my life in general. But when I was a kid, I wasn't particularly motivated.
What kind of things did you
When I
study?
started,
Were you good at any particular subjects, or was it just the curriculum didn't interest you?
yeah, I'd say I was never good with English, and that may become self-evident. Um, and uh, um, and I remember I would have terrible times with say poems and things like this. I just never really gravitated to that. And on math, I did quite a bit better. And and I enjoyed science and chemistry. And uh, the way the school was divided up, I wound up taking the business course in my final 3 or 4 years. And so, I learned to type in high school, which I wasn't particularly keen in becoming an office worker. But that's what I was trained for. And it turned out that typing turned out to be of great value when I get into the computer business because I could run the console when my peers later on, much later, couldn't. And so I learned to type, which was, you know, just a fact in my high school career, and I could type pretty well.
And did you say you were interested in cars or mechanics and mechanical
Yes,
engineering?
yeah, no, this is one thing that, in terms of saying what made me ready for the technical world, and I recall when I was in the eighth grade, which 14 or something, um, I my one of my older brothers had taught me how a car works, and it was using just explanations and pictures from science magazines and popular mechanics, that sort of thing. And so I gave a presentation in my eighth grade class, and I explained about how every part in a V8 engine worked. All of the valves and all the camshafts, crankshaft, everything, all the pistons, the four cycles and all that. So I knew how an engine worked. Except there was one thing I understood how the distributor and the spark plugs worked, but I didn't know how a spark was created. And so this is something that was a mystery to me, which I eventually learned after I was in the Navy and I started to study electronics. And it's probably something most people don't understand how that spark actually is created. And of course, it's a bit different now in modern cars. But yes, I knew thoroughly how a car engine worked, and I thought that's probably what I'm going to be doing after I get out of high school and get on to my adult life. And that never happened.
But that didn't happen. So what happened next? You end up in the
Yeah,
Navy,
I
I
get
think,
out of
didn't
high
you?
school and huh?
You end up in the US
How's that?
Navy, I think, don't you?
Yes. Yeah, the Navy was recruiting. I got out of high school. I didn't have much direction. And so the Navy recruited me, and I did well, or very well on in their test battery. And by the time I got through boot camp, they said I could go to any school that the Navy had. And I chose the electronics technician school, and the Navy gave me a wonderful education in electronics. And they even taught me those bits of math that I didn't understand, that I didn't get in high school. They tutored me. And so there I was. I had finished their school. It was a great school. And they asked me what kind of a ship I'd like to go on. I said, an aircraft carrier. They said, you got it. And I went aboard the USS Saratoga for a few months. And then I went aboard a ship which was just being commissioned, the USS Independence. These were, the largest ships in the world, quarter-mile long flight deck on these things. And so I was an electronics technician. And on that second ship, USS Independence, there wasn't any crew there before we got there. And so for someone like me, even though I was a greenhorn, I had a full set of responsibilities and I had to figure it out. It was one of the many times in my career that I found myself in the deep end. And, but I loved it. And so I was, uh, I worked like mad. I remember just 24/7, particularly at sea, of course. I would eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner and midnight rations, and we were just going all the time. There was an incredibly small crew, as I think about it now, that had to look after, say, all of the radars and the Combat Information Center, and um, all of these things connected with radar. There was another shop for communications. But anyway, there was only maybe 25 or 30 guys, and only some of those were qualified. And so I had to work hard, but I learned every day because there wasn't anybody to help me. And out at sea, and um, there's no
Mm.
internet, there's no access to support. You just had to figure things out. And so you and your buddies, you would just all figure it out and keep going.
So
So
you were working on electronics there. I think you were commissioning the aircraft, the carriers, radar
yeah,
systems.
we getting the aircraft ready for war, and that was our job. And we did that. The ship served in the Cuban Missile Crisis after I was off, and it went to Vietnam. Both those carriers went to Vietnam, and in fact, after I was then in the computer business, I remember I hired a guy who was the chief petty officer in that division where I served as a seaman and then a third class petty officer during my day, and that was some remarkable for me to see how that all transitioned.
Mm.
But an aircraft carrier has got to be one of the most exciting places on earth, and it's also amazing how the Navy constructs the work such that they get all these guys trained like me, 19 and 20-year-olds, and there'd be some thousands of us on the aircraft carrier keeping it all together.
Mm.
And there's the same of the Royal Navy as well. I'm sure it works the same way, and in general, that's the way the military works. But it is interesting the way they do it. And for instance, in electronics school, technician school, the Navy would select a whole pile of people, and if you didn't do well, sort of week by week, they would wash you out. They would push you into another direction, electrician's mate or some other thing. But fortunately, I hung on and did that. And when I came out of the Navy, I went to work for Honeywell, which is a computer company, which was a thermostat company, as you would know. But they in 1960, that was, and I was 20, whatever. They had a very ambitious program to build computers, and they had designed a large transistorized computer. It was among the first transistorized computers, the serious commercial ones. And so I went to work there, and Honeywell was screaming for people like me. And although we didn't know computers, they trained us and me in computer science. It was hardly even a subject college course.
And what was a computer like at this time? What kind of would you say is a transistor-based computer? I mean, it's not like we imagine it today, is it? Describe the computer
Well,
as
let's see.
building it.
A comparison for Honeywell is they had been making some vacuum tube computers, and those vacuum tube computers would fill up a very large room with huge cabinets everywhere. The CPU for the transistorized computer that Honeywell made was 13 cabinets long and a little intimidating. And so what I did was first of all, I worked in Honeywell engineering under an engineer debugging prototypes, which was again in the deep end, because a prototype is a machine that has never worked and has all kinds of problems. There may be design problems, logic problems, wiring problems, component problems, things that the designers may have never heard of. And so you would have to figure this all out. And this was difficult work, and but really interesting. I remember a lot of times having the attitude I just would run into work to get caught up with what's next. And so, and I remember I worked in engineering for a while on prototypes. Then I went out on the production floor where we were commissioning new CPUs. And I remember, and this is where the first thing we do is getting the electric typewriter. It was an IBM's electric typewriter, interfacing with the computer, and you would then give commands, very arcane sorts of things, to the computer to get things started, and I could type. And so it not only tended to have me in charge of a troubleshooting team, but I was also learning a lot by doing this, and it's a little bit of managerial work as well. So I can remember commissioning these CPUs, and it was basically a thrill to get the first instruction working, something about moving a bit of data from here to there, and then progressing on through that entire instruction set until finally the whole thing is really starting to hum. And it was great work, and you could see every problem conceivable in doing this, and great fun. And I love.
So tell me. So I was going to say this. I was about to say. So DEC. You don't stay at Honeywell. You move on to DEC. How did you come to become aware of DEC, and what was the process of going to work for them? Because were you aware of them at this point? Were you starting to get itchy feet at Honeywell?
Well, at Honeywell, there was one thing that I didn't care for was that there were a number of employees in positions like mine who were rather union oriented. In fact, colleagues on the production floor would say, "Hey, Ken, don't kill a job," and I had no thoughts of the job ever getting killed anyway. But
What does that mean? What does that mean? Don't kill the job.
That means that don't work too fast. Don't, I think we would work in shifts there, and you'd keep a logbook of all the problems you pulled out of the device that you would think, and you'd sort of get to, I don't know, 7 or 8 problems solved. And some guys would say, hey, that's enough, And that wasn't my attitude at all. And we had, frequently, we had union people lining outside the company's door, giving out cards, trying to and promoting a union election, which they held and didn't win. But so this was part of the work environment that I didn't care for. The managers in that environment were largely administrative, and so if you expect your boss to help you with a problem, you maybe weren't going to get it from that style of. These are maybe old line Honeywell managers. And so what happened was it was a colleague of mine at Honeywell who in fact became, was Audrey's and my best man when we got married. He heard of DEC and he went to work there as a sales engineer. He was the proper engineer. And so he would come over to our house and bring the digital products, small things over to our house and say, hey, isn't this stuff neat? And indeed, the digital designs were simply more elegant than the designs at Honeywell. And I think it was sort of an evolutionary thing, but digital was just a bit ahead on that. And so I went to for an interview at DEC, and they sort of grabbed me. I was probably the most knowledgeable field engineer they had. And there was 2 DEC computers at the time, a PDP-1 and a PDP-4. And I learned each of those in a week with a bit of a tutorial from another guy, another engineer. And then I was off. Then I was off traveling all over the place. I would go to places like JPL in California, which is involved in Voyager satellites and things like that back in the 60s. All kinds of universities and government establishments, places that an ordinary person would never get into. And working as a field engineer, you're always sort of jumping in the big deep end because you don't know what you're going to see out there. And you've got to figure out what's wrong with the computer, take care of the customer, and, leave a good trail behind you. And
tell me briefly 2 things, I suppose. What was there a lot of computer companies at that time? You mentioned the beauty of the DEC systems. Were they known? How do they stack up against IBM as the big one? Were you aware of their existence before this, and how do they kind of rank, I suppose, in the overall perception, if at all?
I was certainly aware of the other companies. I wasn't aware of the sort of differences in computer architecture at the time. I was an expert on Honeywell and DEC. But I didn't know quite what's going on with the IBM 7090s and those models. I knew that they were big, and I knew things about them, but I didn't really understand the relative elegance as I just expressed about a DEC. The DEC computers.
Did DEC have it have a reputation of any kind at that time, DEC?
Yes, amongst the, I'd say, relatively small science community, universities and government and so on. Big companies like the phone companies loved us. Let's see, something else I was going to say there, but well, maybe lost it. Yes, and the other point is that the digital products were much cheaper than anything from IBM or CDC or some of these other companies, or Honeywell for that matter. And namely, the first computer they made, PDP-1, I think was $120,000. And a few years later, the PDP-8, I think, was maybe, I want to say $10 to $20,000. And so the way that digital products were made was the internal logic design and architecture was elegant, and it was fabricated in such a way that it was relatively easy to pull together. And so digital and its engineers learned fast about how to do that. And Gordon Bell was the chief computer architect in those days, and he talks in his oral histories with the Smithsonian about uh, uh, things about just making it easier. For instance, one thing was that a machine that Gordon designed and I helped him debug the prototype at Digital was a PDP-6. And then that machine was, the back panel was wired by hand by these long benches of women in manufacturing who would do all the wiring. And so then when we're trying to bring these things to life, there'd just be a lot of wiring errors, and it would just take a long time to sort out this stuff. I say wiring errors amongst many other things, but and so Gordon introduced a digital, wasn't exclusively the digital by any means. He introduced wire wrap, which is basically essentially a computer generated wiring list, which would be fed to a machine, and the machine would actually do the wiring between all of the pins on the back panel into which modules, circuit modules would plug. And so this kind of thing, for instance, made the PDP-8 a couple of machines later really quite cheap to manufacture and almost error-free. I mean, you wouldn't find out. You'd be hunting endlessly for wiring problems. And in fact, if there were a wiring error in the wiring program or whatever, you make note of it and hand that information to the next people taking care of the next machine, and they'd fix it before they ever get started. And so things like that made the production of DEC computers easier and cheaper to produce. And that.
I'm interested is and what made them better, because it's one thing to have something that's easier and cheaper for the manufacturer. Right. What made them, they could still be not very good for the customer, but they were very good for the customer. So what did they have that made them such a hit with the customer, for example?
Well, let's see. I think at the time, time sharing and networking were pretty important things. By the time we got to the PDP-6, it was a program that could run by implementation by software. It's an important point. Lots and lots of users. So if companies buying this thing, lots of people in an institution, school, government, or wherever would get to use it, and at the same time. And this was novel. In the earlier days with the IBM machines, if you wanted to, if you were at a university or something and you had a calculation problem to work out, you would program it in some language like, say, Fortran, and you'd get the program would come in the form of a stack of punch cards, and so you'd wait for your turn on the computer, the IBM computer, and you'd give your cards to the operator, and they would plug them in, and then sometime later you'd get a printout out of the printer, which you might even get in the computer room, who knows, and you get a printout back to say what happened, and then you say, oh, that didn't work out right so well, and you'd say, what was wrong with that? And you'd go troubleshoot and go the cycle again. And so whereas on a time-sharing computer, or if it were your own computer, virtually your own computer, you just sort of hang in there and work it out. So like today, if I'm solving some problems with, say, spreadsheets or whatever, I can just sort of make changes as I go. And that's, of course, today's world is everybody has a PC, and not everybody does spreadsheets, but,
And do you think, give me an insight, what's the DEC culture like at this point? We hear about it a lot and you mentioned Gordon Bell there, if you could just state who Gordon Bell is and why he's important. But we hear a lot about DEC's engineering-driven culture. Could you kind of like express that?
Yeah.
Was this as kind of was the work you've just described kind of an expression of that? What is engineering culture, and do you think DEC managed to get it so right?
Well, the founder of the company was a guy named Ken Olson. He was partnered with a guy named Harlan Anderson. Ken was an engineer, and Ken had participated in the design of some very early computers, TX0, TX1, at MIT and MIT's Lincoln Laboratory in the late 50s, mid-late 50s. And so Ken was an engineer, and Ken was always an engineer. And he was always, he never held the title, but he was always, everybody knew he was the chief engineer. And so, so it was very much an engineering culture. I wasn't an engineer, I was a field engineer, but it wasn't quite the same. And, well, let's see, what we could say. Ken was a Puritan, religious man, and Ken had beliefs about how he wanted his company to work, and they were very much centered around the engineers. The engineers would be simultaneously entrepreneurs, and they would take charge of something they designed, and they would make a business success of it. And this is very much what he wanted, and this is what he really encouraged people to do throughout his whole time there. And to some extent, that worked marvelously. And there were other engineers in the company would say, "Hey, I'm an engineer. I'm not really sure that I'm the entrepreneur that Ken talks about, but if the boss wants me to be an entrepreneur, I'll be an entrepreneur." And so we had this mix of things, but it was very much an engineering-oriented company from start to finish, really. And Ken was an entrepreneur. In 1986, I think, he was named by Fortune magazine as being entrepreneur of the century, and it was believable. And so I can carry on about that, but I'm not sure I've handled your question yet about about engineering. What else might I?
So yeah, I think you kind of. So I think we can say it filtered down. This culture kind of filtered down from Ken, and he kind of created this very engineering-driven culture. And you mentioned Gordon Bell there. He's quite well known in the tech industry, and it's quite remarkable that he, amongst many other famous individuals, worked there. Who, just for the record, who was Gordon Bell? What was his input into, the systems? How important is it that he worked there, do you think?
Immensely important. I think he's probably the chief architect of digital computers. He did not design the first one, but he joined the company, I believe, about 1960, which had been 3 years ahead of me. Not that I was ever a rival or pretend to do what Gordon did, but he, in his early days in particular, he was very much involved with, excuse me, yes, the architecture of the computers, namely how they handle data, how they connected, how they did everything. And so Gordon, I'm sort of wanting to drift off in the stories. I worked with Gordon for about a year debugging this PDP-6 that he designed. And one time when we were in California dealing with a customer at the RAND Corporation, they discovered we both had the same birth date, except he was 5 years older than me. And so we were good pals for a long time there, though I haven't seen him now in 30 years. And
he went on to Microsoft ultimately, I think, didn't he? He left when things towards the end. He went on there and made a career at Microsoft, didn't he?
Yes. That was really at the very end. I think that was, to me, I viewed as, he found a home in Microsoft where he could focus on the academic things that he was really interested in. And Gordon was, in the early days when I knew him, he was very much into the nuts and bolts of this stuff about how it all came together. And he was a marvelous engineer in terms of these things I describe about the logic of the computer, the architecture of the computer, the manufacturing of the computer, the suitability for the customers. And Gordon was attached to all of those things in a very deep way, and greatly admired in the company. He ran into some problems becoming maybe a rival. Rival, is that the right word? A competitor with Ken about how things should be done. And I think he thought that Ken did some things well, and he should stay out of the computer architecture business. I'm not sure that Ken Olsen was ever very much of a computer user, which is interesting. I'm sure he understood everything, but Ken Ken was more interested in incentivizing the engineers to make good products that would make a good business, and that's what they should do. They should do the whole thing. Gordon was more the engineer, the computer architect, and followed that along for many, many years. Gordon left the company once or twice and went into academia at Carnegie Mellon, maybe, and wherever else. And Gordon had a heart attack around 1983, which basically slowed down his career a lot. He's still alive today, I think 89.
So let's come back and talk about where you are. So things are really exciting at DEC. A lot of stuff happening, and you're getting to travel. Then you get this trip to Europe, and I believe you're installing the first systems, DEC systems in Germany. But then the opportunity comes up to relocate to the UK, doesn't it?
Right. Those were PDP-6s that I installed in Germany, and I had installed a bunch of those around the U.S. in atomic energy establishments, universities, or otherwise, and so the company had sold two of these systems, one to the University of Bonn and one to the University of Aachen, and doing research in particle physics. And I came over in '65, and because I wasn't sure I would ever get to go to England again, and so on the way over, I stopped in London for 2 nights, and I did city tours and saw all the tourist things, and then I went on to Cologne and did my thing there, and then on the way back to the States in 3 weeks. By the way, that all worked out very, very well. And I went back to the States, and I went by Paris, and again I stopped and had a good look at tourist view of Paris. And okay, so I got home, and the company was concerned. Excuse me.
Is that right?
I do.
Have you got some water there?
We had trained German engineers to take care of those PDP-6s, but I think they were a little insecure about it. So they asked, would I and Audrey like to move to England for a year or so and essentially provide technical support for the whole of Europe on everything, which is still a small company, and in particular look after those PDP-6s and be the first European field service manager that the company had. And so that's the reason why I then found out what was going on in Reading, and we sold off all of our worldly goods in this part of the world and got on I think it was a VC-10 BOAC, and headed for England. And I remember an awful lot about that year. And you know the story, just to tell it again. During the time we were, let's see. The first thing we did on moving to England was we, first of all, went to Germany for about 3 weeks and to check in on those computers there and just deal with a bunch of issues, which I did. And had a great time. We were familiar folks by that time. And nice welcome coming back. But during that time, Audrey was not feeling well. And she had worked for an obstetrician in Boston in the years before. And so she got in touch with him, and he recommended a doctor on Harley Street in London. So we finished up in Germany and flew to London and were picked up at Heathrow by Jeff Finch, an existing digital DEC employee. And I remember it was just a really wonderful welcome arriving on a late November night. And he brought us out to a hotel in Reading. And the next day, Audrey and I took the train from Reading up to London and found this doctor who, you know what I'm going to say next, Audrey was pregnant. And so that was, wow, you know, parents. And we had been married about 5 or 6 years and had wondered about when children would come. So it was a surprise. And that same day, I had ordered a car and had prearranged delivery at a London car dealer. And so we went there and picked up this car. And so I gave myself this first lesson in driving on the left, navigating our way back to Reading. And so that was one incredible day in the life of the seniors. First day in England, new land, don't even know where we're going to live or whatever. And I'd respect it. And so that was the start of our arrival in 1965.
And what were your feelings? Obviously, there's a lot going on, but what were your feelings to be? I suppose that what were your emotions to be to move to Britain at that point in your career?
I was only 26, I think, at the time, and I think at that age, and with my background as sort of always being in the deep end, guess what? There was another jump into the deep end. And by the way, to just back up a little bit, in the Navy, they teach everyone to swim. And the way they teach you to swim, if you don't, I do, they actually throw you into a pool, a deep pool, and there are lifeguards around, but you have to, on your own, right then, learn to swim to the other side. So being dropped in the deep end has a specific meaning. But that's how I felt in my career. But I like that sort of thing. I survived most of those sort of things that I can't really talk about or think about when I didn't. But that was another time we didn't know what we were facing. We didn't know anything about the digital subsidiary. We didn't know anybody who worked there. Didn't know anything about. Just knew what the average American knew about England, which is, Buckingham Palace and the Queen and.
And you said you were preparing for the move. You read that Reading was described in something you'd read as a provincial town, some 40 miles west of London.
Hey,
what was it
right.
like at that time? Obviously, it's quite a large place now, and very modern and mixed kind of environment. What was Reading like? Describe what you saw, what it felt like there.
Sneaky. Yeah, I did have some thoughts about that. Yeah, it was. I remember reading it was described as a provincial town, and so I did that. In my mind, described sort of something above a village, maybe. But I think there were 200,000 people living in Reading back in '65. I mean, it was a city, but it was just the English designation then and now. I think it may still be the largest town in England. And when we had been in Germany, we could see remnants from the war, no doubt. And in the 3 weeks, I got to know some of the people there, and they would talk about their war or their fathers or uncles and things like this. And in England, I was also aware of the war just being 20 years in the past. And there weren't bombed out buildings around, although I had heard that Gilas had been bombed. And other places as well, of course. And I had some appreciation for World War II history, and still do quite a bit. And I was also aware that that England was still very much struggling with the economic recovery from the war. I think in the U.S. the 50s. Post-war 1950s were tough times where, I don't know, I'm not going to give you the economic view, but, if the government is spending billions on war material and then stops and the whole workforce is dislocated, you have a whole armies coming back, and boy, there's a lot going on. But by the end of the 50s, I think the U.S. had kind of readjusted. And my feeling was that in England, they were still struggling with that. Of course, England was impacted incredibly more than anything I saw on the other side of the Atlantic. And so that was going on, that wages were low, and things which had started to modernize in the U.S. were behind a bit. And in terms of houses without central heating, cars were different. There's just lots of things that were different. and people's patterns of shopping for food and so on would be basically shop every day at the greengrocer or maybe Sainsbury's and whatever. So, anyways,
Where were you
we
shopping at this point? You were hitting supermarkets or and
yeah,
butchers?
well, Sainsbury's quite a lot. And but we found that there was a Waitrose in Henley that had parking. That was a great benefit. And there was a greengrocer in Caversham Village that we favored. And Audrey's doctor had told her to, maybe her blood was weak, I'm not sure. Yeah, he told her steak and salad, steak and salad. And so there was a butcher right across the street, Castle Street, right across from Bilby's deck, which I would be over there quite a lot. And I got a little charcoal grill at home, and so steak and salad, we ate well during that time.
And you were living in Caversham. What was the house like you had? A new build, I think you said?
Yeah, yes, um, it was all things considered just fabulous. We there was a couple of places open to us, and we found a place. It was a absolutely new construction in Caversham Park Village, and and it was fully furnished, and it was for rent. And so we grabbed it, and it was just as nice as could be. And um, the only thing about that house is it didn't have a telephone. And when Caversham Park was a new development at the time, and I believe that all of the wires had been installed underground, very modern, but the GPO had not yet installed the banks of relays, which is what they would have had at the time, to facilitate new numbers for all of those new houses. And so we had no phone, and Audrey was pregnant. And I didn't mention yet, but during that year, it was probably physically my hardest year of work in my career. Maybe the Navy was hard as well, but I made some 20 plus Navies, maybe even 25 trips from London Heathrow into Europe and back. And they were often three cornered, go to London, Cologne, Stockholm, back to London, things like that. And I was either trying to hire people for subsidiaries on the continent or fixing things. And I was a busy boy. And there was Audrey keeping things going on the home front and no phone. And so, but we learned to use, people in the office would help and so on. There was a call box down on the Henley Road, which Audrey could use. And I would often send her, when I was on the continent somewhere, not knowing when I was coming back, I carried around the official airline guide, this phone book size thing, which all of the flights in Europe, and I would have the current copy of that, blah, blah, blah. And I'd send Audrey a telegram. I'd be coming from Dusseldorf on BA such and such at 10:30 tonight. And a nice man on a bike would roll up to the house and give Audrey the message, and Audrey would come and pick me up. Thank you very much. And so, but that was just a feature. You figured things out and got things done. But Caversham Park was really a great place for us.
So tell me a little about. So let's focus on DEC a little bit here. So DEC Reading was established in '64. John Leng is credited with the executive who did that. He started quite small with a handful of employees.
Yep.
Just tell us, first of all, there's a story that that it was started with what, $1,000. John Leng arrived from the States with $1,000. Yes. Who is John Leng, and is this? Tell us a little about this story about the $1,000.
Yes, to back up a little bit, John Leng. I'm not sure if John is English or Canadian. For a long time, I thought he was Canadian, but he might be English. Anyways, John earned his degrees in electrical and mechanical engineering at Oxford. And I presume he graduated around 1955. And he went to work at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell. And perhaps also starting around 1955. He was maybe 22 or 23 at that time. And also during 1955, I was a sophomore in high school, but in 55, Claire Lang, John's future wife in Canada, turned 19, and she took the Queen Mary to England, and she wound up with a job also at Harwell. She and John met there and became a couple, got married, and it was after that that they moved to Canada. And I believe that move was probably inspired by joint projects at the Canadian Atomic Energy Establishment at Chalk River. And so then John and Claire were there. And while there, Chalk River became a customer of Digital. And these are things that I sort of pulled together as bit by bit. And so one of the things that Chalk River wanted was a device to monitor one of the reactors. And so they asked Digital, it turned out to be Gordon Bell, who was the engineer who was going to take care of that. And instead of designing sort of a process control kind of gizmo to do the monitoring or control that they wanted, Gordon said, hey, why don't we design a little computer to take care of this? And I haven't certified this fact, but I believe that John was the Chalk River customer at that time working with Gordon. And I knew later that John and Gordon knew each other very well. And so what happened was that Digital made this little computer and did the job for Chalk River. And things carried on from there. That in the digital world, that thing became, I believe, the PDP-5. And so there was John, obviously a great fan of DEC, as were many customers. And John was hired by our Canadian subsidiary as a sales engineer. And after he was in DEC, it became immediately obvious that he would be an excellent person to start a subsidiary in England. And so I have another story that says, this came from Peter Herkey, who was a early DEC employee. And if I could just read from what Peter said to me, happened right at this time. Peter said, I knew John Lang from Atomic Energy of Canada when I was a graduate summer student in 1963. And before I came to the UK as a postgraduate student, only to meet John Lang again, totally by surprise, in February of 1964, when John had apparently $1,000 in his pocket, $1,000 from Digital to open a subsidiary for the company. And so that's as close as I've gotten to what actually was going on there. Of course, Bilby's is a very modest place. And in fact, on that, I remember hiring some engineers while I was there from following interviews in the Paddington Hotel. And these engineers would quit their job. One of them, I remember, is IBM, quit his job as IBM and showed up at Bilby's and looked at the place and said, what have I done? And so Bilby's.
What was it like? What was it like? Describe Bilby's, because we had this story about it's a small address in a back street of Reading above what was a carpet shop, Bilby's. Yep. So what is the office? Describe the office to us.
Well, yeah, the building was a former church, and it was repurposed to be the furniture store, Bilby's. And there was a loft above Bilby's with a side entrance and up some stairs that became DEC's first office location. And I believe probably when DEC rented it, it might have just been a flat area, like one large bullpen, if you would, and to which Digital fitted up some offices. There was a little reception area for visitors to come. There was John Lang's office in the right-hand corner as you entered the facility. My office was a couple of cubicles down the row. There was just a sprinkling of offices and sort of an open area in the middle where the field service techs and some others would be. So it was a pretty Spartan place. But for me, it was a nice place. I should also mention, people don't know, is that the company's main headquarters in Maynard, Massachusetts, was also rather Spartan, except this was a 100-year-old woolen mill where they did make blankets for the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, and it was kind of a grungy place. In fact, the early days in the 1960s, I would come home from work with lanolin on my shoes from the deck plant and take off your shoes. Okay, do that. And so for digital to have some Spartan headquarters Spartan facilities was not unusual. And so the Bilby sort of fit in with that. Although those buildings was like a little step beyond. That place in Maynard, Massachusetts, it was eventually occupied with 1 million square feet of digital. It was a huge place 100 years before. And so, okay, so that Bilby's wasn't so far offline with that. And so it's not surprising that John had a shoestring budget to work with to get started. And
do we know why they picked Reading? There's many theories. What's the feeling of why they picked Reading as opposed to any other part of Great Britain?
Well, my theory is that John and Claire knew very well Harwell, and they probably were interested in opening an office that was somehow near that community. Heathrow was sort of on the other side. Maybe Reading was sort of in the middle. And so I think that just that association of John, Harwell, Heathrow made Reading quite possibly an obvious place. I would be surprised if there were many other alternatives. I would be surprised if they considered, say, Oxford. I don't know if they did much analysis that one might do about workforce availability and skills and things like that, or university. Those kinds of things might enter into a more modern analysis. But I think it was, hey, we can do this here. And it probably wasn't thinking there was a very long commitment. Who knows what the leasing arrangements were? Oh, yeah, 1 year lease. Who knows?
And what was John like? I mean, it's kind of difficult to know him, isn't it? When you see the pictures, you read the text. He's the one who coined the phrase mini computer as well, isn't he?
Right. Mini skirts, mini car, and Morris mini whatever, and mini computer. And John, I would describe him as a quiet man, a bit stoic. I can still see that in the photos that were showing me. In fact, I always thought John was a bit older than he probably was at that time. He was probably 30, 32 or something like that. And he looks to me to be an older, quiet, bit fatherly type. Claire seemed to probably be a bit more of a live wire. But John was a very smart guy, and as far as Audrey and I and me and my work were concerned, he was incredibly supportive, and as was everybody really. But what else can I say about John? John was just really an excellent guy, an excellent fit for what DEC needed at that time. He was already well connected with big customers in the UK, and he was a real DEC fan himself, and so he was just a really excellent match for what the company needed.
And I take it the office. It sounds like the office was going quite big, and then obviously they moved out. You only spent a year or so, I think, in Reading, didn't you? But did you you ran into another of DEC UK's managers, Jeff Shingles, who became synonymous with the company. Do you have any kind of recollections of Jed? Yeah, he became UK MD, I think, in 70 something, wasn't it, or 67? What was Jeff like? Because again, we read about him. What was your draw a sort of picture of Jeff for us as well, if you can?
Well, in the office in those early days, there were two Jeffs. Jeff Finch, Jeff Shingles. I thought they may have had a little bit of a rivalry because they were both the sales managers, senior sales types. And so the thing that and of course, I knew them throughout my whole deck life, and I would see them from time to time in the States, and when we later lived in Geneva, and so I would see them all. But Jeff Shingles, I would describe as, and I'm not the first with this phrase, but I thought him as a rather wise man. He wasn't frivolous, as I might be. Lots of people might be. But Jeff, I thought, was a really a good, serious guy. He was, I believe, a bit older than me, and I never worked for him, but I still maybe thought of him as a bit of a mentor. And I believe that I would not be surprised if you found a lot of people from that time and later who knew Jeff and would describe him as a mentor. And he's just somebody that I like to talk with about company problems and so on. And so on. He's a smart guy. His appearance changed quite a lot over the years. And when I saw pictures of him at a DEC Christmas party, as I looked at it a couple of days ago, I was first of all saying, "Is that Jeff?" It was basically because he looked so young compared to what I remember. And I would have last seen him maybe 30 years ago. So,
do you think how far would we say he maybe shaped the culture there at DEC in the UK?
Oh, big time, big time. The DEC culture was, I think, a thing that is really very hard to describe. But it, whatever the company did, it found people like Jeff who would propagate this set of values, whatever they were, and and propagate them within the new parts of digital as it grew in the world, and of course in the UK. And I could say this about a lot of people, but Jeff very much that way.
What would you say those kind of values were? Is this the DEC way that we hear so much about?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, first of all, I would describe the president of the company was a religious man, a Puritan. Didn't mean that he was a pure man, but is like all of the rest of us. But he did have Puritan values, and it was his expectation that we all would do the right thing in every business circumstance. And so this notion of do the right thing was very common to see in the company. And of course, you can ask questions, well, what does that really mean? But, and of course, then I think you have to say in any discussion about ethics, these discussions may become quite interesting because you can find two sides of it. And says what really is the right thing, and but usually life's problems aren't quite so difficult as those academic things, and you always knew we always know right from wrong. Everyone would mostly agree with that, and.
Was there a kind of definition of what that meant in DEC, do the right thing, or was it more kind of a case by case?
It was always case by case, and maybe a corollary might be do the right thing and do the best you can, and we were very much focused in the company because I was the leader in the field service end of it for a very long time, and we obviously would do well if we looked after the customer. And so do the right thing for the customer was something we could easily understand. And
describe that. What did do the right thing mean for in terms of the customer? And is there a tension with also doing the right thing for DEC, which is obviously to maximize revenue and shareholder returns?
Yeah, well, in the service business, we made a ton of money and we made a ton of profit. And we found we were in the service business, we were a very analytical bunch on how to deliver service. and productivity and who and how to handle all of this stuff. And but if the customer if the customer was happy, we had a much better chance at succeeding at our business goals, because customers whose bacon we saved, they were going to be with us on the next sale and the next sale and the next sale after that. And so we had a very good relationship with customers in the service business. We at some point in time we started a large survey business once a year, and of course now these days it's surveys on everything. But in those days it wasn't so common, and we found that customers took those surveys very, very seriously, and we received them by the thousands, and we responded to every one. And we that had a problem mentioned and so on. We used them to we compiled them into scores, and we ranked all of our offices by that. And I know that for my own part, I finished up as a field service manager in 1979, and for years ahead of that, I did top 10 award dinners, and I did like 30 plus of these things. And this is where Audrey and I would troop out to someplace, Kansas City, or wherever, and we would have a celebration for the local branch, and it would be based on them being a top 10 branch in the opinion of their customers. And in fact, it was this one of our branches in the U.S. for North America at the time it worked for the for NSA, the U.S. spy establishment, as spooks. And this office had a sub branch in Leeds and another one in Germany. So while I was doing those top 10 award dinners, I also visited England. This is much after my European adventures, and I did award dinners there and in a bunker in Germany. So anyway, so customer satisfaction was a big deal, and if you weren't doing that, no matter what else you did in the company, you weren't a good guy. So we paid attention.
And we also hear this kind of like, there's this culture of responsibility of being given freedom to do what you wanted to do. But if you adopted that freedom, you had to have the responsibility to see a job through, isn't there? Is that considered part of the DEC way as well?
Yeah.
Like, not necessarily do the right thing, but part of the DEC way?
Yes. Very much. You say, going right down to the field engineer again. Being a field engineer, you're out in the woods somewhere, and you've got a customer, you've got problems, and you've got to sort it out and figure it out and get it fixed. And you run your own, and the company is always counting on people like that, like myself in the earlier days, to get that done. And that kind of attitude applied to anybody with any significant job responsibility, sales, engineering, logistics, and so that was very healthy in the company throughout its life, and I think that was motivating for people, and so they liked it. I liked it.
So you spent a year or so in the UK. What was your reflection? You get a brief taste of the UK in Reading. What's your kind of feeling? Sad to leave it behind, or looking forward to new challenges?
Yeah, I knew that while I was in the UK, as I described, this is crazy. I was traveling all the time. It was a physically very tough year, and so while I was in the UK, I knew what was going on in the US, and the things that I had been doing in the US, particularly to do with these the PDP-6 computers, the development of the field service organization, the hiring of droves of people. I knew that was what I was going to be facing going back. I didn't understand quite what. And let me just digress for a little bit here. It might be cycling back a little bit on. But I did hire a lot of people. I hired a lot of field engineers. And I liked it. I liked it because if I could, I might spend a week in the Paddington Hotel interviewing people one after another, day after day, trying to figure out, could this person go out in the field and fix computers on their own, be trustworthy, be good to have as part of the gang. Anyways, I might spend a week hiring a person in that mode, and that happened a lot of times, not so much in the UK, but in the US, that happened a lot. And I thought, what else could I do in 1 week if it yielded one new employee? Because that new employee might stay with the company for 20 years, and they often did. And um, and so I very much was attached to this idea, was just hire good people. It's the best thing I can be doing. I might be fighting fires on all sorts of fronts in between all of that, but just hiring good people is something. And those people who hopefully would fit in with the company's ideas about looking after the customer and being able to function on their own, and if they needed that, and so on. So anyway, so that's a digression. And you were back on, what was the next thing you were asking?
So I was asking, so you've moved on, and what happened after you left Reading? Where's your career take you, sort of briefly? So you've gone on to, I think, Geneva, then you end up in the office, the head office, I think.
Yeah. So what happened after England was I became the regional field service manager for the Northeast region, which was a relatively easy job. That was the area including New England, and so I would take care of that business. It was already a fairly well-established organization, and so I, basically kept that going. But what I really did during that period was I ran around the U.S. hiring people. I wasn't so much fixing machines anymore, but I was. I mentioned that I liked hiring, and a lot of my cohorts did not. They thought this is just a terrible duty. And because it was boring, you talked to a lot of people you'd say no to, and but I liked it, so I ran around the country, and by doing that, I was the hiring manager for just lots of people who wouldn't necessarily work for me immediately after, but they knew me, and so that just helped me get along in the company with lots of these people thereafter. So after the Northeast region, then they assigned me to the Mid-Atlantic region, which is from New York to Florida, big Mid-Atlantic. And I did more of the same, more problems to solve down there. And 3 years had gone by since leaving England, and they asked me if I would go back to Europe again, this time to Geneva, which is the same job and much bigger. And so family, by this time we had 2 children, and we moved back to Geneva for 3 years, and I did more of the same there. And then after Geneva, then I moved back to the U.S. and became the U.S. in total field service manager. I attended a business management course at Harvard Business School, and I did that until about 1980. And then I became responsible for strategic planning for sales and service for the whole company under the sales manager. And at that point, I saw an opportunity, and I took a sabbatical from the company, and I went to MIT and got a master's degree. And in my earlier story, I mentioned that I just went straight from high school into the Navy. And so I didn't have an undergrad degree, but I got into MIT and I got a master's degree in management. So I was still fancied myself as a technical guy, but and I had learned a lot by then about management. And so I was a Sloan Fellow, and I was in amongst 50 of us mid-career executives, and quite a great group. And so then I came out of that, and for the rest of my career, I was always involved in strategic planning, and I like that as well. And strategic planning, you wind up with a plan, but the way I handled it for the sales and service is that I made it into an integrating function amongst all of the product people, marketing people, all of whom there's a bunch of people around who maybe had a planning title, and so my office helped give them a process, all work with, and so there was lots of communication happening and so on. So that was really good work.
So
And
you said you were so just
no, I
let's talk
should
about
have
the end
carried
of deck. So you kind of moved up. You said you had something of a front row seat, I think, towards the end of deck, didn't you? You were
Yes, yeah.
secretary to the board, I
So
believe, and the executive committee. What did you see? Because and
yeah,
just you described Ken Olsen, his character before this. What's
right.
going on at Deck by this point, and
Yeah,
what are you seeing take place? Because we all know Deck is no longer with us. What did you see? When was this? When were you secretary to the board, and what do you see happening?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So what happened is about 1988 or 89, my boss, the head of sales and marketing for the company, he abruptly left. And I probably don't want to say too much about that, but he was suddenly gone, and all of the and that was a real sort of trauma in that company. And his functions, all the sales and marketing, was parceled out to other guys at the top. And for myself, I was probably chief of staff of this guy, and um, and I thought I'm probably gone as well. And I remember I was sat for some months, and I had one remnant group that worked for me. It was a group called Management Science, and it was an internal consulting group of maybe like 50 um, scientists, PhDs, and so on. And we did internal consulting in the company. But I had a manager for that group, so I didn't have too much to do. And so I thought I'd probably get a polite phone call one day and say, Ken, you know. But anyways, I did get that call, and the call said, hey, Ken, would I come and be secretary to the company's executive committee and the board? And my first question was, why me? And they said, because you know everybody in the company, you know how the place works, and we need somebody. So I moved over to the corporate headquarters with the office right in the president's office area, and um, I had always known Ken Olsen. He had always known me in a reasonably cordial way. I had never crossed swords with him in any way, and so he seemed to trust me right away. And my job was creating the agendas for the executive committee meetings and the, at that time, monthly board meetings. The company had sort of was falling into trouble. And so Ken basically accepted these agendas I would make for him. And my feeling at the time was I didn't know if I was toast or not. And I thought, well, since I don't know, I might be gone soon. I don't know. Who cares? Well, I'm here. I'm going to do the best job I can for the company. And so if I can help save the company, I'll do my bit and help. And my way of doing that, I had about as powerful a job as any employee. I was creating the agendas for both the executive committee and the board. And I would put everything on there that was current business that had to be dealt with. And Ken I would show him the agenda. Here's what we got. Here's what we need to be doing. And he would mostly just agree. And that surprised me that he would, sometimes I would have things on here and he would say, no, we're not doing that. And, but some of the things, once we got in the meeting, like I remember there was one meeting where I was working with people in our treasury, and we had to let the board know what was happening with cash. We were burning cash like mad. We had $3 billion and we were going through the cash. And so I put it on the agenda. And another thing I did for these meetings, I would review the parade before the meeting. I would make sure everyone had a chance to tell me what they were going to talk about. I would advise them about what to do. Sometimes they paid attention. Sometimes they didn't. They did better if they did. And so I remember this one thing where we previewed where we gave a presentation to the board on cash flow, and Ken approved the agenda. Wheels were running. We showed up on the day, and I remember I always used to wear my dark blue suit and the red tie, and um, which made a difference. Anyways, so during that meeting, Ken always sat right beside me. I would sort of direct the meeting whenever he needed it, a nudge here and there. And he was just shifting in his chair so much that I
Mm,
thought, well, this may be the end for me. And but it wasn't. And so
mm,
that was a very interesting sort of end of my career. What happened subsequently is that I thought that I had done about as much as I could in the 2 or 3 years I had that last job. And the company was going to offer a first early retirement program for employees because the company was in trouble. And uh, and so I knew it was only going to be a one-off, and I knew because I
mm,
was sitting in on all the meetings. Plus, I would drop into any meetings I want. People knew who I was, and like the retirement committee meetings and things like that. I knew that they intended only to have one early retirement plan, and so I thought, I think I'll take it. I've done the best I can here, and I would probably lump out with my retirement rather than take, and and so when that was announced to the board in I think April of '92, the board told me forcefully, Ken, this is not for you. We got too many people that are just not working. Their jobs have disappeared on them or whatever. And so I thanked them, but I decided to leave anyway. And while I was leaving, I thought DEC had bought some small companies in, say, the software business or whatever. And I knew all about these because I had shepherded them in front of the board and so on. And so at that point of leaving, I said, you know, if I could be of help with some of
mm,
these little companies, I'd be glad to. And they said yes, loudly. And so I picked one, and it turned out to be Basis Automation Systems in Langley, next to Slough. And um, so I became chairman of that company. And uh, and so my job was to integrate
mm,
them with the parent. And so the first day I showed up in Langley to meet the people there as the new chairman of the company, the news I received was that the board had fired Ken Olson. And uh, so, and oh, it was just amazing. I could, in some ways, I knew the company was in deep trouble. And the way I had thought about it in that final year or so was that there's got to be an intervention. And now, this is another little digression, was about Ken Olson as a manager. That he was considered a genius in some quarters. This 1986 appellation, that he was the entrepreneur of the century. I thought was probably right. And my observation about management, which by that time was pretty extensive, was that often the reason that managers fail or that companies fail is they become too much attached to the status quo. And the genius of Ken, as I'm happy to
mm,
use that phrase for him, was that he was not attached to the status quo, that he had all these things going in engineering with all of these folks who he was wanting to become entrepreneurs, encouraging them all. And they all thought that Ken was his friend. But I knew over long observations was that he would periodically over the years, he would come in on a Monday, having had a weekend of angst on the phone with everybody in engineering probably, and not me, but he would come in and he'd say, nope, we're not going to do this product anymore. This group is now going to report to such and such. Nobody got fired, which is a great thing about DAC is that people rarely got fired. And they always find another way. And um, uh, That was Ken, and so we'd get off one track and onto another. Now Ken, at the end of Ken was that he had some of these kinds of problems. He had two large major engineering projects. I'm not going to name the names here, but they were both spending tons of money on the development of the follow-on products. And they were both successful products. And I remember, and I could go to any engineering reviews I wanted. I used to go just to see what was going on. And I remember asking the manager who was giving a review, and he was up front, and I said, "Hey, Joe," he said, "who are your customers going to be for this new XYZ thingy-mabob that is a big thing, maybe $100 million in investment? Who are your customers?" And he said, "They're going to be Fred's upgrade customers." And I said, "Oh, we're doomed." Because Fred also had a mega engineering investment for his upgrade customers. But this was Ken sort of getting people to compete with one another. And this was possible in the early days of the companies. Like in the 70s, in retrospect, I described it as engineering as, let 1,000 flowers bloom. The beautiful ones were worth so much that they paid for all that other stuff. But as computers became a bit more commoditized and so on, you just couldn't do that. You had to make more decisions. And so I thought at the end, the reason that Ken failed was that he got fired, was that he did not intervene in that situation that was happening, and some others. And as a result, the company continued to deteriorate, and the board intervened. I thought it'd be Ken would either use the word intervene. My thought was that Ken would intervene as he had done so many times before, or the board would intervene and say, "Ken, you can't do this," or the stockholders would intervene. Something like that would happen. It turned out to be the board that intervened.
And they fired him. Was it like
Ken
a vote, or was it a vote, or?
He fired, no question. He offered him the prospect of resigning. He said, "No, I'm only leaving if I get fired." And he was fired. So
what's your reflection? What's the legacy then of DEC looking back? Obviously the technologies have gone.
Well, I would say there's maybe people like me. I don't know how many there are of us left, but people like me, I still grieve for the place. I didn't want the place to die. I expected in the DEC heyday that it would be around more or less forever. And after Ken, they put another guy in charge who wound up selling off the company. He didn't do well in my judgment, but he wound up selling off the company to Compaq. And when I got that, I was well out of the company. And when I heard that, Compaq, they're a company that makes laptops, and we made faxes, we made big computers, we made time sharing, we had revenues of $14 billion a year. We had 110,000 employees at one point. What's Compaq? So Compaq is fine. So Compaq got sold to Hewlett Packard later on. So I am now a grateful Hewlett Packard retiree. Never worked for the company. When they broke the company up, the service business was, I think, the thing of greatest value that Hewlett Packard inherited. And so, in some of the service people that I knew went to work for Hewlett Packard, because that is all now 20, 30 years ago. And those people also retired, and the service business has changed.
And so does it have a legacy? Is it the people? Is there a technology legacy? Is there a cultural legacy of DEC in the world, do you think?
I think it's invisible. Maybe it's invisible to me, and I'm watching for it. And it's mostly a historical story, and it was great while it lasted. I thought it would last forever. It didn't. And I think, again, in that final job I had, I was also advising Ken, on these agendas, and I would tell him, what you've got to do is you've got to get business reviews on every agenda. We've got to figure out what's winning and what's not, and change what's losing. And he would say to me, he'd say, "Hey Ken, you're just a lawyer. You're trying to stick it to these engineers." And and he would be laughing while he would do it, but I was glad he was laughing. But again, I I was just basically going to tell him what I going to tell him. Another odd thing I remember happened once with Ken was that in this job, he would periodically grab me and say, "Hey, I want to find out what's going on with X, Y, Z. Power supplies or some location over there or something in manufacturing, and um, uh, go find out what's this and this and this and this." And so I remember, I would do that. Sometimes I wouldn't do it because he was simply trying to get me to finger somebody, and I just didn't want to do that. And but I remember one time he said, "When you get it, find me wherever I am, and let me know what you find." And so I went around. He was having a meeting in somebody's office, and I went in and I plunked the stuff down in front of his desk. And I said, "Are you happy now?" And you know, pleasant, jovial voice. "Are you happy now?" And he says, "I'm not meant to be happy." And I thought, man, that does describe this guy. His he felt good when he was in the soup and solving problems and had something to chew on. And so I think when he said he wasn't happy, he laughed when he said it. But I thought there's a big bit of truth there that tells me a little more about the man.